It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sébastien Dubray, who is the teaching professor of French and Francophone Studies in Second Language Acquisition and Technology Enhanced Learning at Carnegie Mellon University. He is published in the Modern Language Journal, the Calico Journal, the International Journal of Personal and Virtual Learning Environment, and the L2 Journal, among many others. In his work, Dr. Dubray investigates ways in which language learners connect to and co-create communities, whether physical or digital. In terms of the latter, so the digital communities, that invite students to participate in thoughtfully designed multimedia-based experiences, such as ebooks development, production, and publication of various videos, or game design, which is Dr. Dubray's most recent research interest. His recent work includes the development of an online and mobile game to investigate French learning through both gameplay and game design. The latest project, a game entitled Bonne Chance, was selected as a finalist for the 2015 Reimagine Education Conference. Today's presentation will take another and critical look at games, and we'll do it through the prism of distance instruction. We'll see how games and game design can be more than entertaining intermissions by serving as avenues to structural language instruction and to help our students bond as a community of learning. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Sébastien Dubray.
Thank you, everyone. It's very good to be here. And see, I know that's exactly what you wanted to do on another Friday afternoon is do more Zoom, but it appears as though it is what we do these days. So the only redeeming quality is the commute is usually pretty okay. I want to, before I start, I really want to thank Stéphane and Simon and Rashan just for the invitation and organizing all of this pretty smoothly. It's always a pleasure and an honor and a privilege to be at Columbia, and it carries with it the added privilege of being able to see some friends and colleagues from Yale as well, usually, which is really fun. And I have known you to be a welcoming and demanding audience, which is all the more fun because it's always usually after the presentation that I learned the most, and so I'm looking forward to that again. So I'm gonna see if I can share my screen and see if you can see this. I lost you in the process. Yep, is that working for everybody? Okay. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the end game is how do we build community in the classroom, and what I'm going to talk about today is how I use games and game design to try to do this. And because this is recorded, I want to go on record and say that this is the only way you can build community in the language classroom, and you should all do this. No, I'm just joking. It is just one way. I found that I've tried other things that work as well. But this is one way I found that is that sort of jive with where I am at the moment in terms of how I envision language pedagogy and why we actually do what we do. Before we go any further, today marks the 42nd birthday or anniversary, I should say, of Jacques Brel's death. Jacques Brel is a French singer who was born in Belgium. And was a giant of French music, songwriting and performance. And he has been, he's my mom's favorite singer. He has been my companion for ever since I've been on this planet. And today is the anniversary of his death. So just wanted to pay a little homage to him. So what we're going to try to do today is a few things. I'm going to tell you why games, or at least propose a few elements as to why that might be a good idea. And then I'm going to explain to you what happened last spring, spring 2020, when I was teaching a class on games. And halfway through the class, we had to go all remote. and how what ended up happening from the instructor perspective and then from the student perspective. So that's the course, and then what we're going to do, and then COVID and what we ended up doing, and then what I learned through that, and how that sort of led me to align with some of the precepts or tenets of what people like Jesse Stonewall have called a pedagogy of care. So one of the reasons why I got interested into games is, as you may know, and some of you who have seen me present before. Yeah.
Don't mean to interrupt you. If you are showing a slideshow, your slideshow is not advancing.
It's not?
No.
It's advancing. It's advancing for me.
Not advancing for me. I don't know.
All right, let me hold on. Let me do that. How about now? Still no?
It is sometimes the case with PowerPoint. When you put it in a presenter's view, it tends to struggle.
Let's resume that and see if it works. All right. You should see Jacques Brel right now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and if I do that?
It moves.
Okay, perfect. So I make this joke almost every time I present now, because I really do think that we are getting to urgent on this front. And the joke goes, how many teachers does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer that we oftentimes is change. And that's really not a good answer, right? We all know, and I'm sure colleagues at Yale and Columbia, your work speak for itself. So you've been on this front line for a while now, but our disciplines are not what they used to be even 10 years ago. Our students certainly aren't what they used to be or who they used to be 10 years ago. And the way we understand the mission of language education is certainly not, at least my understanding of it, is certainly not what it used to be 10 years ago. And so not changing is just not an option. And so one of the ways in which this has become really salient for me came out of this reading of Deborah Smith-Shank article entitled Semiotic Pedagogy and Art Education, in which she says the current teaching dynamic assumes that there is a correct body of knowledge for a teacher to communicate to students. In order to move away from the dominant hierarchical model, it is necessary to develop an entirely different framework, right? And that is one attempt at developing such a different framework that I'm going to talk about today. Jesse Stonewall, most recently in a piece called Designing for Care, Inclusive Pedagogies for Online Learning, said there has been much talk over the last several months about maintaining continuity, and I know we've all heard it, of instruction and assessment, but less discussion about how we maintain the communities at the heart of our educational institutions. Right. And one of the problems when I don't know about you, but at CMU, one of the first things that we went to when the pandemic broke was how to solve the technological difficulties. Right. Nobody mentioned how this situation was going to influence or have an impact on the students and their daily realities, and how that was going to have an impact on instruction, and how the instruction that we were going to deploy in this new environment had to change to accommodate for that reality. So why games? Yesterday, I don't know if you guys listened to NPR Morning Edition, but yesterday there was an interview with Erno Rubik, who is a Hungarian inventor, put together this little thing you may know called the Rubik's Cube. And he said in that article, that in that interview rather, that at first he found it difficult to solve his own puzzle, right? But he said the more difficult it was, and the more enjoyment to solve it. He said play is one of the most serious things in the world. Most people are taking most of the things too seriously, he said. They really can enjoy life because of that. So all the time they would like to achieve something, they force themselves to achieve something. So to do something playfully, and then he paused and he said, if you don't really mind if you are winning or losing, you just enjoy the play. So the problem is if you are not able to win, you become very sad. And he goes and sort of flips that argument, and he said, I learn most from my failures. That is the way to learn, and that is the way to be successful. And that right there is a radical shift on A, why people play games, and B, how we best learn and how we best understand students. We have trained students to gain access to higher education by giving the right answer on standardized tests. And that is just not linked in any way, form, or shape to what we would understand as deep learning, to paraphrase Jim G. Um, uh, and if everybody agrees that we learn best from failed states, then why is it that we never put fail states at the heart of our educational enterprise, right? Or every student walks into the classroom thinking they have an A in the class and that everything they will do will make their grade fall precipitously into the abyss, right? As opposed to, hey, you know, when at first you don't succeed, try again. And so games are uniquely equipped to actually do this for a variety of reasons. One is that people usually play games because they're hard. People don't play games because they're easy. If games are too easy, you get bored, right? If games are too hard, then they become inaccessible, nobody plays them. So the games that are successful are games that are just, as Jim G once again puts it, pleasantly frustrating, right? Where you don't succeed all the time, but somewhere you know that you might make it, right? And you just keep on trying, which is exactly the kind of behavior we'd like our students to display. And then the other thing that are great about game is that the consequences of failure are pretty low, right? You mess up, you lose, well, you start another game and maybe you'll win that one, right? So I thought that was a very timely interview with Rubik yesterday for this presentation. So forever, games have been, and I'm not going to be one of those like, oh, since the beginning of times, men have played, but it is true. Humans have played for a long time. And play has been a very powerful social engine to create and curate societies and human communities. And UNICEF, in a recent, and by recent, I mean a 2018 report that they did together with the Lego Foundation, have identified play as a fundamental human right, right? And they advocate that, UNICEF advocates that children should be encouraged to learn through play, right? The other reason why I think games are interesting as a medium of instruction for languages and cultures is that they are very uniquely situated cultural objects, right? Not everybody plays games the same way. I was talking, I'm fortunate enough that this semester in my class, I have the president of Carnegie Mellon's Dungeons and Dragons club. And she was telling me that, you know, so you're all familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, I assume. So players play characters. And she says it is really interesting to see when people have to play a good character, how they perform goodness depending on what their cultural background is. And it is not at all the same thing, right? And so they have the same framework, they have the same characters with the same labels and the same skills, and yet they do not perform goodness or politeness or etc. the same way. And that I find is very interesting. So from that, I infer that if we pay attention to what types of games cultures produce, we are provided, and the way they play them and the role that they occupy in the cultural landscape, we are provided with a unique window into that cultural system and the language associated with it, right? For reasons that I just described, games are proven learning tools. And it's also a way to engage design thinking as a pedagogical approach. And I'll show you in a minute what that means. In the area of language learning, I know you're familiar with the work of people like Jonathan Reinhardt and Julie Sykes, who in this fantastic book called Language at Play, they explain some of the reasons why games would be good avenues or good media through which to engage in language and cultural learning. Games are goal-oriented, they say. They also provide plenty of opportunities for interaction. They are highly contextualized. In fact, Steve Thorne calls them hyper-contextualized because there is really a limited horizon of possibilities. Games provide immediate feedback, right? If you play well, you win. If you don't play well, you lose. And they are intrinsically motivating, right? Very few people go onto their deathbed regretting having played too many games, right? They may regret having worked too hard, but no one says, and I know there's research on this, it doesn't break the top 10. No one says on their deathbed, I wish I had had less fun, right? Or played fewer games. And finally, games are learner-centered, right? It's the player who is at the heart of the playing enterprise. So now let's revisit why I like to work with designers and look at the same joke. How many designers does it take to change a light bulb? And what a designer will usually tell you is, does it need to be a light bulb, right? Does it need to be a light bulb? Because if your problem space is creating more light in the room, then maybe light bulb is not the best solution. Maybe opening a window is the best solution, right? And so what designers are great at doing is reframing problems and lateral thinking, right? So they will find different solutions to the problem within the problem space, given the constraints that are there. And they will actually evaluate these different solutions in what is called a competitive audit to try to find the one that is the most appropriate, right? Which, if you think of language learning as a way to cultivate what some people call, semiotic agility or linguistic repertoires, then that's exactly what we're doing, right? We have these different things that we can choose from, language choices, and that we're going to deploy in a cultural context. And some of them may be preferred choices and other dispreferred choices, and they will have consequences, right? So to look at design a little bit more carefully, what's interesting with design is that it is both a product and a process, right? It's a design. Oh, that's a great design. That's the product. But if you say a design, the design process, that's the process, right? And so working on this sort of double understanding of design as both a noun and a verb, we can start to see how perhaps games as a product, but also game design as a process could be a good I guess, medium to think about learning languages. This is one model of design, this idea of this sort of cyclical way of act, reflect, change, right? Act on the environment, reflect on what we just did, and then change what needs to be changed and iterate. So this idea of game design as an iterative process. Gameplay is also an iterative process. You play, you lose, you play again until you find a way to win. And this brings me to one of my favorite quotes from a student with whom we're engaging in the design process, where he came to the conclusion that answers are really boring. It's really the questions that are interesting. And right there, you can see that this is somebody who can be taught, right? Where he's less concerned about finding the right answer and more concerned about asking the right questions. So what are some of the critical skills that students might learn in gameplay or in game design? One is you have to make a plan and then you have to follow through. And that is really hard. And you'll see when I show you what the students have said at the end, how important this is. Two, you learn from trial and error. That is for sure. Your first build or the first time you play a game, you're usually not very good, right? There's a few games that are where it doesn't matter. For example, party games, and we'll get to that in a minute, where being a bad player doesn't matter because winning is not the object of the game. The object of the game is just playing. But and when you design games, the first build is usually terrible, right? But you play test it, and then you make it better. And the second build is not quite as bad, and you play test it, and you make it better. And by the time you get to 4 or 5, or in the real world for game design 50, then you get to something that actually cuts the mustard, right? So right there at the center of the enterprise, you see that failing is not just a problem, it is actually desirable. You cannot design a game without failing. Through this approach, you also get to apply concepts of quantity, science, movement, but also language, communication, and collaboration to real life problems, which is playing or designing a game. You learn to reason in a logical, analytical manner by acting on objects, meaning the objects that you play with or design. You communicate with classmates and negotiate differences in points of view, which is Language learning is nothing if not adopting multiple perspectives, or at least being able to envision them and consider them, derive satisfaction from your own accomplishment, and develop creativity and explore aesthetics and artistry, just to name a few. So why is there such a resistance to gameplay? On the right here is a screenshot from the UNICEF report where they say, you know, play is meaningful, play is joyful, play is actively engaging, play is iterative, and play is socially interactive. And yet there is such a resistance to perhaps deploy this in the educational sphere. So some of the arguments that are put forward is that there is a lack of understanding of the value of play as a foundation for academic concept. There is a misconception about play as frivolous or taking away from true learning, whatever that means, right? Because we all know that having people in rows all facing forward when the teacher is lecturing at them is definitely highly correlated to learning. People don't know how to build curricula around play or around games, which is I could receive that problem, which segues into the next one, which is teacher training. If you don't like to play games, or if you don't see how that applies to your teaching, it's kind of hard to do. So you have to train. And finally, sometimes class size is not always conducive to games or to play, right? So that could be some arguments. So after this somewhat lengthy introduction, let me show you what the course that I taught last semester, which was Jeux de culture et culture du jeu, loosely translated as culture of games and gaming culture. This is an excerpt from the course description where I advertise the course as follows. In the French cultural landscape, there is a privileged role for play as a form of entertainment, but also as a way of learning and a vehicle for constructing the social bond. Play is central to human societies and cultures. Learning culture by studying its games provides unique insights into what brings people together and how that culture is transmitted. In addition to providing rich cultural representations, games are effective learning tools because they provide players with opportunities for problem solving and honing a variety of skills. I also would like to point out that play in French, jouer, I think French is the only Roman language that I know, at least, that does not differentiate between jouer, playing a game, and playing, say, an instrument, for example. It's the same verb, it's jouer, right? And so it tells you right off the bat, and even in the language, right? We have things like jeu de mots, language play or language games, right? That's part of that's how we envision play. It's this really broad, deep-reaching sort of notion that sort of marks the cultural landscape. So my goal was to really develop an active learning environment. And I borrowed here from that same report, where this idea of weaving a tapestry where the students are really co-learners with the instructor and not just these empty vessels that will receive the fantastic knowledge that I have to impart. It's an environment where students are actively invited to bring their voice in the dialogue, who they are, what they bring, their experiences, their aspirations. Invite students to collectively and collaboratively mediate their ideas about concepts critically and conceptually. It's an environment in which everybody is encouraged to model disposition inherent in constructive dialogue, meaning listening, being respectful, but also invite students to practice these prosocial behaviors of listening, active listening, fairness, caring, empathy, and respect. So the course objectives were to identify and apply the principles of game design, increase knowledge and understanding of French, describe and reflect on the relationship between games, language, and culture, demonstrate intercultural understanding by applying knowledge and understanding of French culture through game design. So, we took games as models. So instead of taking movies or pieces of literature or what have you, we actually took French games By the time I was done assembling my collection of games from the shop that you see behind me, I realized that I had enough materials for about 50 weeks of instruction. And I don't know about you guys, but my semester only has 15. So I had to really narrow it down. So I ended up with 3 genres of games. One is party games that are really making a huge comeback in France. The second one is cooperative games, because they're called Euro games for a reason. I mean, they really belong as a point of origin in the European cultural system. They originated in Germany, and France is making its bread and butter right now in the board game industry in developing some of these co-op games. And cooperative games, if you don't know what that is, I don't presume that you wouldn't know. They're games in which the players don't play against each other, they play with each other against the game, right? So you win or lose as a team, okay? And the last one was escape games. And escape games is interesting because they were born in the US and they have boomed in France. I think there is per capita about twice as many escape games in France right now as there are in the United States, right? So that was the plan. And so these games were taken in part for the unique role that they occupy in the French cultural system, right? And just to give you an idea of what I mean by how heavy it is in the culture, games have recently overtaken books as the most sold cultural good in France. It didn't used to be the case even 3 years ago, right? It's only in the last 2 years that this happened. And it's not just video games. When video games started to really proliferate, everybody was like, "Oh, it's going to be the doom of the board game industry." Last year, the board game industry was a $500 million, no, 500 million euros. Sorry, $600 million industry, right? So it is a huge undertaking. And what are people looking for in board games? The social element, being around a table and playing with each other. That is, by all accounts, what we know about people who play board games. Right? So the class proceeded as follows. We had a couple weeks of introduction where we actually read articles and book excerpts about games and French games and Euro games and so on and so forth, about game design to try to extract some tools that we could then leverage in the rest of the class. And then after that, the cycle was as follows. We would play games together. So that was the first. So we dedicated about half of the class time to playing games and analyzing them, and then the other half building them. And just so you know, because I'm also very discontent with the way we've been stuck in deploying instruction, where it's like Monday, Wednesday, Friday for 50 minutes. I think that's ridiculous, and that's not adapted to most of the things I want to do. And so I asked for permission to reverse the course at CMU. When students meet 3 hours a week in class, we're supposed to be able to expect 6 hours a week of homework. And I asked for that to be reversed. So I had the students with me 6 hours a week. We met Tuesdays and Thursdays for an hour and a half, and every Wednesday night for 3 hours. And they only had 3 hours of homework a week, because what they needed most is to be together, right? So we played together, then we analyzed the content of the game and the mechanics. I should have closed that parenthesis, really, because those words are just going to fly away at some point. So it was really a collaborative construction on the board, on the computer, everywhere we could, of, okay, what cultural elements are present in the game? What language elements are present in the game, and how is the game mechanics serving these cultural and language elements, or what can we retain from these game mechanics? And then the fourth question was, what are the affordances of such a game for language and cultural learning? Which was the that part. And then after that, we would build games. So like I told you, so this was the common denominator for all 3 units. And now I'm going to show you some of the things that were built. So first, we built party games. And the students were in 2 teams, and they built 2 games. One was called Association on the right, where and if you're not familiar with party games, they're usually games that are where winning is really not an option. I mean, not really important. You know, you have a judge, and they judge according to completely subjective criteria, and they give points or they take away points, and it really doesn't matter. The goal is to be there, have fun together, and play. So in Association on the right, the game is you have 3 community cards that are on the table, and then you have cards in your hand. You have 4 cards in your hand. And then there is 1 judge each round, and it turns. And then the goal is each player plays a 4th card, and based on the 4 cards, his and or hers and the 3 that are on the table, explains how the 3 cards or the 4 cards are linked. So you can create a story, or you can have a common theme. It doesn't matter. And then the judge says who wins based on whatever criterion. If you think it's funny, if you think it's clever, if you think it's so dumb that it deserves a point anyway, etc., etc. The one on the left, I thought was a very interesting and daring game design. It's called MEMSA, and it's same thing. You draw a card. It's common to everybody, and everybody has to write a caption, like a meme, for the card, right, in French. And then people vote. Everybody vote for who they think is the best meme. So this is where I thought it was interesting, because I never won. I was the only native speaker of French in the whole thing, and I never won. And the reason why that is because meme is a genre that is really native to these kids, and they were 50 times better than I was at meming, at writing captions for these pictures, right? In a language that was a second, or in some cases, 3rd language for some of them. And it was just unreal. I was like, okay, more power to you. You can do things with language that I cannot do, right? Now, I beat them every day of the week on email, but they are really good at memes. So then after that, the students were encouraged to build a digital version of these games. And we used for that a platform online called Tabletop Simulator that is available through Steam. And there's another one that works kind of the same called Tabletopia, if you're maybe more familiar with that one. And so that's what they did. So they input all of their materials into the computer, and that's what you see on the left. And then on the right, you see two of the students playtesting other teams' games to see if it was working well. The second gesture or moment in that class was to show students that you could actually take a commercially available game and actually enhance the game to make it more accessible for language learners, right? So we play a game called Guédelon, which is a co-op game based on a historical project in France. Guédelon is a castle in Burgundy that is being restored by a group of historians and whoever is volunteering to help them to see if we can rebuild a medieval castle using medieval techniques in the same amount of time that it took them to build it in the first place. Right. And so there's a game designer who decided that he was going to design a game about this, where people get to play with like traditional professions, like a stone carver or a mason, et cetera, and as a co-op game. And of course, because it's modern times, you get slowed down by visitors and tourists and all that stuff. You have to go sharpen your tools when they get dull, and so on and so forth. And so it provides a really rich historical, cultural context, but the gameplay can be difficult for students who are not at an advanced level of proficiency, right? And so you see on the left here, the students played the game, and the yellow post-its are actually them annotating the game board to make it more accessible for people. And then we recreated a game board with those annotations, right? So that language learners could play. And then all the materials on the right is material that the students created to scaffold gameplay for less proficient students, right? So they created a turn card, which is the two things right here in the middle, that explains or sort of summarizes what your actions ought to be each turn of play, all in French. And then some language elements on the right here in construire une phrase, that, you know, verbs and nouns and stuff that you can then leverage to communicate with your fellow players, because again it's a cooperative game, so you have to communicate with your team to finish the castle. They also thought that there was too much pressure, because one thing that you may or may not know about co-op games is that they are built to fail, because you want to play again, right? So usually when you play co-op games, you lose more than half the time. So that it's an encouragement. Well, next time we'll get it. I see where we went wrong. Next time we'll get it, right? And people keep on playing. But they thought that it'd be too discouraging for language learners, and so they actually created ways to get bonuses by creating event cards, that is at the bottom right here, so that you could actually get like extra turns or extra tools or extra resources, so that you had a better than average chance at winning, right? Which of course is something that you also have to play test to see if it actually works. But then more interestingly, they also created a pedagogical guide that explains to teachers how you can use this material and what are some of the content things that you can do around, like ahead of playing the game, but also after playing the game, so that you can really leverage the cultural content and historical content that is in the game, right? So, and then after we had done these two things, we just unleashed the design process. And then the students were in 3 teams this time, and they created their own co-op games, still with the mission of making those good for language and culture learning. So here are some of the things that they created. This one, this team picked, it was called Ascension. And it was looking at the succession to the throne of France between Philippe de Valois and Philippe d'Evreux back in the 13th century. Don't ask me why they picked that one. To this day, I still do not have a satisfactory answer. But the really interesting bit is that at the end, between these two, it's Philippe de Valois who won, you know, the famous Valois family who reigned over France for many, many years after that. But in the game, you're actually playing Philippe d'Evreux. Or actually, you're playing a team of characters who are trying to get him to the throne, because it is then in line with this idea that because it is a co-op game and because you're supposed to lose most of the time, it's really an attempt to reverse the course of history, which more often than not, you can't. Right, and so they created all these games. So you can play an aristocrat or a painter or a tailor, or a knight or a magician, because it wouldn't be the Middle Ages if Merlin was not around, or a cardinal, right? And then based on this team of players, you have to get Philippe d'Evreux to the throne. Another one was a topic that always shows up when you ask French students to do something: food. So this one is called Pâtisserie Pot. It's a co-op game where the Ritz-Carlton in Paris asks you to make pastry for an event that they're going to hold. And so you have to collaborate. And this one you can play in French 101 week 3. It is that easy, which was a beauty about this one. It is super clever. The visual vernacular is outstanding. And the rules are pretty simple. And so you have to go and collect ingredients here. And again, see, you have a turn card here. You have the rules. You have to collect ingredients. And then every time you have a recipe here, you have the cannelé, and here you have the tarte tatin. You have to collect as many ingredients as are shown on the recipe. What is interesting with this one is that every time you take, so that's the recipe card. Every time you take a recipe card, at the back of it is, it explains what the pastry is without naming it. And if you get to name it as a team or as a player, you get bonus points, right? So there is a little cultural vignette at the back of every card. And then here you have event cards of things that are going your way and things that are going not your way, like people are on strike, or the Carrefour is closed, or all their eggs are bad, or whatever. And so that's sort of where we stop with this. And they were finishing this when spring break arrived and COVID hit. And that's where we really had to do some serious thinking about what's happening next, because the next unit was on escape rooms, and we're going to go and play escape rooms in Pittsburgh. We had reservations. It was going to be great. And then we're going to create escape rooms in our classrooms and play test it with students, which of course is not so desirable in the age of social distancing and a global pandemic. So my colleague and I was co-teaching the class with a colleague, really thought hard about, okay, what do we do now? How do we retain the original intention of the class, which was really a social enterprise of playing together, sharing together, analyzing together, building together. You've seen the classroom. It was food, paper, scissors, glue sticks, Lego cubes. And how do we translate this in an environment where the students are going to be, I had a students in Wisconsin, I had another one in Australia, it was all over the place. How do we retain the original intention? How do we retain the instructional integrity, where they're going to have to do something that is rigorous, but also meaningful and in line with the objectives of the course? And more importantly, how do we ensure the continuity of the community of our learners, both intellectually and emotionally? So that translated into actions where we decided that we were going to connect the course to the pandemic itself. Because it increasingly has become part of the way I envision what we do as language instructors, which is to do good in the communities around us, or to do good in the world, period, or to foster cultural understanding and empathy and sort of the social well-being. We're going to externalize it's also a way to externalize the tension of the pandemic. So, okay, well, we're all in this boat together, but we're going to harness what we do and benefit other people who may be in an even more dire situation than we are, right? So we decided to shift the game genres because we couldn't do what we were doing. And so we opted for to revisit party games. Okay, now that's a genre, you're going to start there. But now we're going to do party games that you can play on Zoom. And then we opted for a second game genre that is really interesting called roll and write games. And the reason we did this, roll and write games, as the name indicates, is a game where you roll dice and then you write something on a piece of paper. The most famous one of them is, of course, a game like Yahtzee, for example. But what is interesting about roll and write games is that, one, French designers are inhabiting that space pretty fiercely. And the second thing is that the vast majority of roll and write games have been designed in the last 2 years. So it is an extremely current new thing that game designers, or design space that game designers have been interested in. And so it was sort of interesting and relevant to try to be in that space. And the last one was interactive fiction games. There are text-driven games that I'll show you in a minute. So one of the party games that was created is by a team of students called Cubizoom. And Cubizoom is something where you play on Zoom, and you get they designed some clues, and you go and get them on Quizlet. And so you can see here that they actually wrote out how to play on Zoom, how to create your own Quizlet. So they have a Quizlet deck already, but if you want to play more than once, you may want to add things. So they added instruction on how to do that. And also a pedagogical guide and some things you can do with your students before and after the game. So in Cubizoom, we're all together, and then we all go to a breakout room except one person who gets a clue, and they have to draw it on the Zoom whiteboard. And then everybody comes back and they have to caption that drawing on the whiteboard using text boxes. And then and then people vote. Right, all the people who've drawn vote for who is the best one by putting a little check mark or an X or whatever, and and then the person who drew the picture votes. I mean, that's how you determine who wins, is who gets the most votes, and then who gets the most votes goes and becomes the artist. So that's one of the party games on Zoom. In the roll and write, I'm going to show you two. To see how people understood the and how they were starting to think as designers. One team decided to revisit the pastry game that they had built, and they made it to where you could play on Google Slides. So these two screenshots right here are actually Google Slide. One has the title, and then here you would put the names of the people in that are in the class. So they're color coded. And then on each slide, you have the rules of the game here. And then you have the ingredients, and then the pastry that you have to make. And every time we play 2 dice, and so there is a common dice camera. Usually when I do it, it's an iPad stuck between a pile of books, and underneath is a box where I roll the dice. And then the 2 dice, you choose 1 dice. So if I roll a 1 and a 6, you could choose 1 of 6 ingredient, numbered 1 to 6 here. And then, so if I roll a 1 and a 6, you have the choice of milk and sugar. If you pick 1, then the other die is how many of that ingredient you can get. So if I pick milk, I can get 6 milk. And if I pick sugar, I can get 1 sugar with a 1 and a 6, right? And then with that, you have to you take these and you put them on top of your little icons there, and then they change color when that happens because they become darker. And then you can, when you get to the end, you can you've completed that pastry, and then you can actually click and drag that pastry to the fridge, and then that's how you accumulate points. And then you get bonuses if you complete more than 1, et cetera, et cetera. Another roll and write game is about transportations in France and how we can navigate from region to region. And so the goal is to visit as many regions as you can. So same thing, 1 die is the mode of transportation, and the other die is how many of those you can have. So you have to allocate resources under constraint. And then the last one is about visiting. It's called 12 Days in France. It's about visiting different regions. And same thing, you put a little X in your, depending on which resources you decide to, how you decide to allocate your resources. And then you can get bonuses at the end of a row, bonuses at the end of a column, et cetera, right? Interactive fiction game. It's a text-driven game where, in this case, you play a gastronomic critic. So before I move to that, the interesting one with these two is that instead of revisiting something that was already done, they actually started anew. In the interactive fiction, you get to, in this case, you play a food critic, and you're in Lyon, and so you meet actual critics. So they went and did that research, and then you get to choose where you go. And then the goal of the game is, it's like a choose your own story adventure a little bit. And if you impress the critic that you're with, you get to go to Paul Bocu's restaurant, which is right outside of Lyon. So they tied it all to the cultural context. So that gives you an idea of sort of some of the things that they created. So what did we learn? What the students said they did learn, and I don't have time to show you more detail of this, so please take my word for it. I'll send you the evidence if you want to, but this is gleaned from journals, conversations, and interviews that I've had with them, journals throughout the semester, and then focus group twice in the semester, and then interviews at the very end about what they said they've learned. They really enjoyed the interactive learning, the playing together, the analyzing together, and then the fact that they felt like they really learned from feedback, both in the playing process, but also in the design process. They learned how to align learning goals and game mechanics. They learned about different facets of French culture and how to explore them. they said they will never look at playing a game the same way again. That we will always have that critical distance now every time we play a game. So every time we play a game, and we're like, okay, how could I use this in French class? You know. They also learned that unlike writing papers, it really takes stamina to build a game because you have to iterate. And then when you think you're done, you realize that you're really not until you are actually done. And they also learn project management. So many of them said, oh my God, you have to keep track of everything. That's so hard, all the assets and the mechanics and the iteration and the feedback and the this and the that. And so it was pretty intense. I have this one twice because it's really important. Also, excerpts from journals, because I thought that was interesting how they make connections to things that were happening outside of class. One said, oh, yeah, a few weeks ago, I read an article about alphabetization in the US. And they were saying that some students have a hard time reading academic prose, and so maybe accessing the same concept through games would be a better idea. And I think at this point, I think that games can teach just as well as textbooks. And he said right now, students' motivation diminishes because with the quarantine, they lost that physical space for learning. And so as a result, a lot of students lose interest in school. She said that for that reason, that particular student said that this course is particularly relevant because there is no precedent for that amount of Zoom classes, and the old techniques no longer work. And so now is a good time, she says, to integrate games into classrooms, because she pursues by saying that she sort of sensed that community when we were playing game together. And another student said, learning through games is a topic that we talked a lot about in this class. She says specifically, I remember mechanics, essential vocabulary, what gets repeated. And she says, I remember the vocabulary from Guédelon better than some of the vocabulary I learned in other games, like the party games, where she felt like she was less focused on the language and more focused on having a good time. And so her conclusion is that what really matters is the narrative structure of games, and that having a strong narrative would yield better language learning, which is not completely false. And she finds that games are a great way to recontextualize learning materials in a significant manner. And she thinks that the games will be even more effective if the design of the game is prudent, as she calls it. It'll be, and then this one was really interesting. Because this student really connected who he was with his major and his and the course. He says that his major is mechanical engineering, and he says in that we do a lot of team projects as well. But he said in these projects we only have to overcome a technical challenge. He said the projects in this course were very different. For example, the aesthetic dimension and the user experience were really foregrounded in the game design, because of course you're designing for players and they have to learn in this case. And he says that these are concerns that are not at all part of mechanical engineering, right? Which is kind of crazy to think about. And so ultimately what he thinks is that, I'm going to start thinking about my engineering project with the aesthetics in mind. Just because it's engineering doesn't mean it shouldn't be pretty. And then in conclusion, he said he learned a lot about how to work as a group and how to approach these challenges in addition to the pedagogical objectives. So other behaviors that students exhibit is, and that's based on my observation of the class, is that the students gelled as a group, really. They became more active and benevolent listeners. Just to give you an idea of what I mean by gelling as a group, you remember that they were meeting 6 hours a week, and they were meeting 6 hours a week on Zoom with a student in Australia. So she had to get up at 6 in the morning to do 6 to 9 game class. Everybody had their camera on, everybody was involved, everybody was talking, and they were really active in the breakout rooms when they had to work as teams. They became, I think, better collaborators over time as their critiques of gameplay and game design became sharper, but also their understanding of design rules became a lot more robust. They displayed an increased mastery of different genres. So they had to write game rules. And if you've never written game rules in your life, these are really hard to write. And they also had to write pedagogical guides, which was interesting. They provided deep examples of self-reflection through their journals and their interviews. They made connections between disciplines. They made connections between the course and the proverbial quote-unquote real world. And they stayed engaged throughout the end of the semester, which was not a given. So I'm going to pass on this because I think that I touched on this a little bit. So this led me to really dovetail, and I'm almost done, I promise, with this idea of the pedagogy of care. Why did reflecting on the course after the fact, why do I think this worked? We spent a great deal of time explicitly showing verbal expressions of care. We also showed nonverbal expression of care. Importance of name is something that caring pedagogy talks about. By the time we were at the end of the semester, I did know everybody's name, so that was fine. There was a lot of time spent outside of class, mentoring students, meeting with them one-on-one, one-on-team, one-on-one conferences, mentoring them about future, what they were going to do next. Some of them were graduating, so they had to struggle with finding a job and so on and so forth. To show feeling of caring, so not losing patience, showing kindness, understanding where people were showing up late, understanding when people were having a bad day. And trying to build them back up, build relationship with the whole person, not just the student. Which of course, when you spend a lot of time playing, gameplay was French class, but gameplay was gameplay. So people were talking about anecdotes from their childhood. They were talking about, oh, that reminds me of a game I played with my grandmother, etc., etc., etc. One of them, Stefan, had a Greek grandmother, so that will tell you. And I know, right? And then it also showed me that more than ever before, you have to be able to respond to students' questions and concerns, which for me is hard to do. I hate email with a passion, but I had to step up to the plate and really be responsive to the student. It also made me, both as I was teaching this class and as I was looking at my own children who are in 6th grade and 4th grade, struggling through making sense of online courses. I mean, they did well. They were not starting that, but I was looking at the kind of work they had to do, and I was thinking, oh my God, is this really what real instruction, or I mean, like what usual instruction looks like? Where I felt like a lot of it was busy work, and sometimes my kids would just lose it, thinking, why am I doing this? And it really makes you wonder, or question at least, the validity and the legitimacy of the kind of instructional material that we put in front of our students routinely, and the kinds of ways in which we ask them to engage with that material. And finally, class size, of course, smaller class size is better in this sort of caring pedagogy, but in this case, I had a very small class, so it was fine. So what that translates into, and I double down on my idea, is this sort of flexible learning environment that works towards more equity, having a routine, maintain clear communication, foster togetherness. Don't lose sight of the well-being of your students. Relationships and well-being are probably more important than assignments and compliance. Forget tests. I didn't give one single test in this class. Why? Because the proof is in the pudding. If the students put together a playable game where the mechanics align with what they're trying to teach, I don't need to give them a filling the blank test to show me that they know how to conjugate the verbs that they put in their games. Playing the game is enough. Designing the game is enough. Playing the game is enough. Acknowledge students' experiences and recognize how they can be part of learning. This works best because the students brought all of who they are to the table. They all leverage their own experiences. One was an engineer, one was a designer, one was a mathematician, a statistician, et cetera, et cetera. And all of this is brought to bear on what it is we're trying to accomplish. Learning works best when it's active. And finally, it works also best if you give if you give students opportunities for critical thinking. And by that, I mean to give yourself the opportunity to be wrong and to learn from it. So I'm going to conclude with two more quotes. Our ability to develop community will depend on our willingness to continue feeling joy, having epiphanies, asking hard questions, and sharing our curiosity with one another. That's a recent same thing by Jesse Stommel. And then another older one by Bell Hooks. As a classroom community, our capacity to generate excitement is deeply affected by our interest in one another, in hearing one another's voices, and in recognizes one another's presence. And with that, thank you for your attention. And I am happy to answer questions until it is time for you to go have a drink.